Hi, today I want to discuss freedom as the essential condition for human flourishment. This is because if we're ever to truly thrive, we need to be free. And yet it seems that few people appreciate the political ideas that simply have to prevail if we're ever to fully achieve freedom and maintain it. And things like our ability to achieve happiness, our ability to create wealth, are very much dependent on our freedom. So if we wish to do those things, and we wish our children to be able to do those things, it really behoves us to try to fully understand this concept of freedom and indeed what it rests upon, what's required. And as usual, we have to step outside of the matrix to gain this understanding, because a lot of the assumptions within our mainstream cultural download are just simply wrong. So to kick off with then, I'll offer my definition of freedom. Freedom is the ability to act on one's own judgment, the ability to act on your own judgment. And this means essentially freedom from the interference of other men, whether in the form of individual criminals or gangs or tyrants, dictators, or indeed governments. Freedom is a necessary condition for proper human functioning, as I hope to demonstrate. And we know that you can actually keep somebody alive in a cage, in a state of slavery or servitude, but it's not a fully human life. And actually, it's in no one's rational self-interest to keep anyone in those conditions. So one idea that tends to muddy the waters of understanding freedom is the distinction of freedom from versus freedom to. But it must be remembered that freedom from interference is the more fundamental. When we speak of freedom to do things, freedom to go on holiday, for example, it requires that you have some money or some currency in the bank account. So your level of wealth can affect your freedom to buy a house in a particular area. The most fundamental thing we must remember is that if we're all unrestricted by the interference of other men, then essentially the playing field is level. So we have to be careful when we hear the argument that some are freer than others in this respect. Another important thing to be aware of is that not everybody wants freedom. Sometimes people who are sufficiently aware to know that we need freedom, they want more freedom, they're campaigning for it, might not appreciate that not everybody wants it. And freedom to act on your own judgment necessarily implies a need to assume the responsibility of exercising your own judgment, of choosing what actions to take. So not everybody is both willing and capable of doing this. So not everybody wants freedom. And another category of people don't want freedom too. Freedom will not be a priority for people who live off the efforts of others. Moochers and parasites won't want too much freedom. Politicians with their heads in the trough of public money will certainly not want too much freedom. So generally speaking, anyone whose existence is subsidized by the harnessed effort of others will want less freedom as opposed to more, just as a parasite wouldn't want to be free of its host. In terms of degrees of freedom, we could see that freedom exists on a sort of a sliding scale from virtually none to unlimited. And we can appreciate that in a practical sense when we think about educating our children and allowing them more freedom, as their age and context dictates, things like that. And we can see the political spectrum of freedom if we imagine or if we contrast life in the United States of America around the early 1800s, for example, with Pol Pot's Cambodia or Chairman Mao's China. In the former case, they're virtually a considerable amount of freedom, I should say, and obviously those other two examples, virtually none. But if we are looking towards human flourishment, if we really want to live the best lives we can as human beings here on planet Earth, we really need to be focused on unlimited freedom. That really is the ideal scenario. And that might surprise some people who may, think, oh, hang on, we need limits to freedom, surely. But let's just explore that idea. In a free society, rational men and women would be limited, if you can call it that, simply by the non-aggression principle. And this holds as paramount the need to not violate the rights of other people. And specifically, this means that you mustn't injure their person, you mustn't damage or take their property, or you mustn't otherwise harm their interests in any way, shape or form against their will. But when you understand that the condition that we call freedom can only exist in the absence of aggression and violence, it's somewhat meaningless to speak of limiting it by, refraining from practicing violence or aggression. But clearly that is the issue around which some people have a problem. We can't be free to do absolutely anything, follow any whim, and of course you can't. Of course you can't infringe upon other people's freedom, and that is the essence of freedom. So it should be it's really as simple as that. It's non-aggression. As soon as we don't aggress against each other, bingo, freedom is possible. And it should be similarly simple to grasp, easy to see, that we need the recognition of reality as an objective absolute in order that men may interact in this rational and peaceful way. It's the only way this is possible, when we all meet in reality effectively. So if we place the facts of reality above whims, wishes, wants, and all sorts of subjective ideas that people might personally believe for various reasons, if we subordinate all of that to the facts of reality, then men can rationally persuade each other using reason and evidence, and with reality as the ultimate arbiter of truth. This is an essential precondition for peace, freedom, and abundance. And it means that we have to reject all forms of subjectivism. They must be discounted if it's freedom that we're after. And yet, within the matrix, we see subjectivism, mysticism, absolutely all over the place. But essentially, subjective ideas, if one tribe of people over there sort of channels from their super being, and this tribe of people over here have got the word of their supreme creator, of course all of that is mysticism. There's no evidence for it, and it simply becomes a battle to assert whose ever story over other people. So it's only by meeting in reality and rejecting all forms of mysticism that we really can ever forsake the need or give up the need for violence, for ramming ideas down other people's throats, because we can simply point to reality. We can reason and evidence. So governments and freedom. The proper role of government is to protect individual rights and, of course, protect our freedom. But the sad reality that I'm sure a lot of you are aware of is that your government is the main enemy of your rights and your freedom. And it'll violate your rights in the name of protecting your rights, which is an obvious absurdity. But, your wealth is expropriated from you in the form of taxation to fund wars and, of course, to pay the police to protect your property. So all kinds of infringement of personal freedom and violation of individual rights are actually practiced by governments in the name of protecting your freedom and your rights. The freedom of the individual is effectively sacrificed to the wider community, and this is essentially collectivism. It's the political theory that results from the ethics of altruism. Under this kind of system, which is advocated by many socialists today, you implicitly have no right to live for your own sake. Of course, it won't be explained to you like that by socialists, but this is really what it amounts to. You have a moral obligation, a duty, if you like, to the tribe, to the party, to society, and you know, those with their needs are greater than yours effectively have a kind of first mortgage on your productive effort, and you're not allowed to keep all of your own stuff for yourself. And this really is a very important and fundamental point that must be understood for the emergence of a free society to even really be possible. Altruism is fundamentally opposed to freedom. Altruism is the ethics of collectivism. So it's the ethics of the political theory of collectivism. Rational egoism, on the other hand, is the ethics of freedom. This is rational men acting in their own rational self-interest. And as long as rational self-interest is considered evil, which it is in the mainstream at the moment, and the ethics of sacrifice are considered good, which they are in the matrix at the moment, freedom really has little chance. And this is really the root cause of why we see freedom diminishing. So let's look at the sort of different types of freedom. People refer to different types of freedom. They're not really different types, but let's call them different facets of freedom. So we can say that to live a human life, we must be free to make and act upon our own decisions. And these decisions necessarily affect other people, so they are by definition in the realm of politics. So political freedom is therefore, you know, the fundamental kind of freedom, if you like, that we need to thrive. And, you know, if you just imagine for a moment being alone on a desert island where you're safe from the interference of anyone else, you would be completely free. And, you know, incidentally, you'd be completely responsible for your own continued existence without, you know, the help of other people. So political freedom refers to the total freedom of action available to you within your specific country or tax farm. And then economic freedom, religious freedom, freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And these are all sort of forms of political freedom, or they all come under the category of political freedom. Then there's personal freedom, which would amount to, you know, being mentally free, freedom of thought, freedom of choice. These are all personal freedoms. So political freedom can, of course, it's possible to completely remove that if someone's incarcerated, if they're thrown into a cell in solitary confinement. You have no political freedom, but you would still have some degree of personal freedom in that you'd be free to think your own thoughts. Very, very limited. It's difficult to imagine complete loss of freedom, you know, barring, of course, total physical disability. So in some respects, we need to remind ourselves that we can take for granted freedoms such as, you know, what kind of toothpaste to use and what to eat and what kind of car to drive. But it really must be understood that in order for there to be more than one kind of toothpaste or more than one kind of car to drive, this requires a certain level of freedom, and this is often not appreciated. It requires economic freedom in the form of at least a semi-free market for these products and options to even exist. And of course, in the Soviet Union model of socialism, these options didn't exist and no such choices existed. Freedom of speech, it's is the ability to express our ideas in public, without consequence, without being locked up. And it's a good barometer of political freedom, because tyranny can't stand in the face of truth. It really can't. Any form of oppression can't stand in the face of truth and reasoned argument. It has to necessarily rely on propaganda and lies and spin in order to maintain the myths that support its existence. The truth is, of course, that men must be free. So if the ability to freely express ideas becomes restricted by creeping and subtle forms of censorship, it's a giveaway sign that political freedom is being lost. With respect to economic freedom, in a free society, economies wouldn't be controlled. You'd have the split of economy and state, just as we've had the split of religion and state, for the same reasons. So, but however, because these days still governments we haven't evolved to that level of freedom, governments still control their economies. Economic freedom is affected by political considerations, and economic freedom is generally a function of political freedom. For example, your economic freedom in 20th century Soviet Russia was practically non-existent, but in 19th century America it was comparatively unlimited. It's worth pausing to contrast those two systems and their relative achievements. 19th century America, a huge explosion of wealth and the lifting of the standard of living of millions of people, arguably right across the world, compared to the degree of economic freedom in Soviet Russia in the 20th century, and all of the misery and stagnation and suffering and indeed death, the millions who died under that system. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Economic freedom is the ability for men to trade without arbitrary restriction or regulation, retaining full private ownership of their products and their profits. And it rests on the freedom of men to own the results of their efforts, property rights essentially, and the products of their labour. Economic freedom is the essential precondition for the creation of wealth, for the creation of better and cheaper products, and the general advancement of technological progress. So the last facet of freedom I want to look at is being mentally free, and I think this really occurs when you achieve a level of psychological independence and you start to live your own life according to your own chosen values. Then you've really arrived at a certain mental freedom, and it equates to a certain level of self-esteem, and the crucial thing about it is that it really opens the door to the experience of happiness. And in a context where more and more people are depressed, depression is in epidemic proportions, we really, really need to know a little bit about the roots of happiness, and I've spoken to them elsewhere on the website. Please check that out, there'll be a link. So the essence of, or the upshot of mental freedom is that you have the capacity to reject what others want you to do in favour of your own preferences. This kind of freedom should really be a universal personal growth priority, because happiness depends on the setting and achieving of our own personal goals, specifically, as opposed to doing what we're supposed to or conforming to the expectations of others or of society. And you can maximize your degree of mental freedom by pursuing the gaining of knowledge, intellectual sovereignty, and being a fully independent thinker. This is a key way to gain mental freedom and self-esteem and increase your capacity for happiness. So let's just explore a little bit more of why do we need freedom. it should be by now probably fairly self-evident that you can't experience a happy life if you're living entirely according to somebody else's diktat, somebody else's prescription. Imagine if everything that you did was dictated by somebody else and for somebody else's benefit. It would quite obviously be dreadful. It's easy to see how undesirable this would be. But it's also possible to demonstrate the need for freedom in reason as well. It's not just this self-evident thing. And here's why. It's because life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated purposeful action, meaning you need to act to live, and you need to act successfully. You need to do the right things. And therefore, you have to be free to think, to choose your values and your goals, and free to act so as to achieve them. You have to be free to test your ideas and free to make mistakes on the way to finding out what works and what doesn't. You have to be free to produce and keep the results of your efforts, because life requires you to do that. You have to keep working to keep living. If you do nothing, you don't eat, you don't sleep, you don't drink, you die. So life requires action on a fundamental level. And this is why we must be free to produce the values we need, whether it's as simple as growing food to eat. And we must be free to keep the results of your efforts. Because if you're producing stuff and somebody else is redistributing them, well, then you're just a slave. And it's also when we're free to produce and keep and think and judge, and this really is the essence of living a fully human life, as opposed to the life of a parasite, which might seem all well and good. You might inherit a fortune and think, la-di-da, this is great, but really that isn't the essence of a human life. And this is of course the root of why people widely acknowledge that money can't buy you happiness. Keeping the products of your own efforts is reality's reward for the productive, for the thinker, for the rational individual. And it gives people the incentive and motivation to discover new and better ways, products and technologies. And on the other hand, the destruction of property rights that occurs when we forcibly redistribute wealth actively discourages human achievement. Force is what destroys freedom, as we've seen with the requirement for its absence. It's only other men who can take away your freedom, and force is the only means by which they can achieve it. Back to that desert island castaway situation, you're completely free because no one's there to prevent you from acting on your judgment. However, in the current social context, we have two potential enemies, and that is criminals and governments. Reality dictates that in order to live, humans must think and act on the basis of their thinking, and force is the only way to make them act against it. And this is why the initiation of the use of force is evil. It's fundamentally evil. It is literally anti-life. And most people can easily grasp this imperative for peaceful persuasion on the interpersonal level without any problem. Most people can easily see the need to not be aggressed against by another individual. And yet somehow when we go up to the political level, the same people will often advocate a system that is based on force and coercion. And this is really why the conversation needs to be had, so that people get a chance to sort of join the dots and make their thinking consistent. So let's take a quick historical perspective on freedom. And it's important to acknowledge that throughout history, men's freedom has been pretty limited, really. They've been subject to various degrees of tyranny, whether subservient to tribe or pharaoh or god or emperor or society or what have you. Always the rulers, the kings, the pharaohs have had a fantastic time and enjoyed lots of freedom, but of course everybody else hasn't. The individual man has not been free to live for his own sake, unencumbered again by this obligation to other. It's quite an important thing to understand. So it's really crucial to grasp that we must be free to live for our own sake without any of this moral obligation as we've looked at before. But it doesn't necessarily imply, it's really important to understand that being free of any obligation to serve somebody else or to serve the state or to help other people, it doesn't mean treading all over other people. It doesn't mean being nasty. It doesn't mean using other people. It doesn't destroy the concept of kindness and consideration. In fact, kindness and consideration are destroyed by the obligation to help others. If it's an obligation, then kindness doesn't exist. So it's very, very important to, when we consider the idea of living for our own sake, we're just removing the moral obligation aspect of it. And without acceptance of this idea, and this is deeply ingrained within us in the matrix, it's the idea of altruism is absolutely permeates everything in our culture. But without acceptance of the idea that we can live free of moral obligation and act in our own rational self-interest, humanity can never really be fully free. So it was the age of enlightenment in the late 17th and early 18th centuries that really gave birth to our current level of freedom that we're enjoying. And it was a period of philosophical thought that began in Europe and centered around the idea that reason is man's primary means of understanding reality and improving his condition. The age of reason, as it was also known, broke the monopoly of religion and mysticism in determining almost every aspect of human life. Here in England, the increase in political freedom ushered in the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, which of course spread over to the States. And there followed a period in history where millions were lifted out of poverty, as I've alluded to earlier. Huge amounts of wealth were created as a direct result of the increase in economic freedom. It was only the birth of the United States of America in 1776 that the individual man really fully tasted almost complete political and economic freedom. It wasn't quite complete, and it's been diminishing ever since. The country was founded on the groundbreaking idea of the state being subservient to men, and this was a first in history. It turned upside down the situation that had dominated, ever since. Men were suddenly free to an unprecedented degree, and consequently, this huge explosion in innovation, in technology, in invention, as well as the explosion of wealth creation. It was philosophers such as John Locke, back in the UK, who inspired the founding fathers way back, and he inspired them to question many of the previous assumptions that had historically informed social organization. The ideas of the Enlightenment were things such as men acting on self-preservation and rational self-interest. And these ideas were incorporated into the Declaration of Independence of the United States. However, importantly, or crucially, the ethics of altruism remained unchallenged. Most of the founding fathers were, of course, Christians, and the ethics of Christianity is altruism. So that was the Achilles heel, really, in the implicit ethics of altruism remained unchallenged. And it's because of this that the root cause of our steady loss of freedom has been in place basically since then, since the late 18th century. The philosophical premises on which freedom rests, such as the primacy of reason and individualism, have been, steadily declining ever since then. And ever since the publication of Immanuel Kant's A Critique of Pure Reason, very shortly after the birth of the United States. So it was a time when freedom was just being expressed, but also ideas that were anti-freedom were just being born, if you like. And indeed, Kant's work has a huge influence as we go forward through history, and still remains so in this ethics of altruism. Today, of course, altruism dominates, and the political consequences are encroaching collectivism and the relentless erosion of political freedom. And I find it amazing sometimes to consider that even in the face of overwhelming evidence that socialism and communism lead to decline and stagnation and suffering and misery and death, murder at the hand of the state, it's still claimed by some that true socialism hasn't yet been tried. You only have to look around the planet at still current modern day Venezuela to still see that socialism will never work. It can't, because of its moral foundations, because of its philosophical foundations. So it can't really be overstated, at the risk of repeating myself, it can't be overstated that the ultimate root of freedom is that men must be free to live for their own sake, without any moral obligation to provide for the needs of others or to society in general. And this is what it means to really truly be able to act on our own judgment. It means that our judgment on how to act must not be encumbered with this obligation to act against our own rational self-interest. So I also want to point out that here in England and many parts of the rest of the Western world, we've never been as free as the people once were in the United States. Although we enjoy a good degree of freedom across the Western world, we are by no means completely free. And in fact, our freedom is in decline. Socialism, collectivism is on the rise, along with the steady erosion of property rights, increasing censorship, state propaganda. So the vast majority of people, while they're sort of dazzled by the mainstream narrative and trivia and so forth, don't notice that changes are taking place behind the scenes. Increases in surveillance, obviously a very obvious one, the tip of the iceberg. And then you've got the Patriot Act and the Homeland Security Act in the States, and then in the UK we've had the equivalent with the Terrorism Act of 2000, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001, the Prevention of Terrorism Act of 2005, the Terrorism Act of 2006, etc., etc. And all of these amounts to more state power and less freedom for people. Let's also look at the cumulative tax burden, the financial aspect of our loss of freedom, because it's very significant. Here in the UK, the cumulative tax burden is hugely underappreciated by most people. The average worker has been estimated to work for about anywhere between 7 and 9 months of the year to pay tax. This is a colossal amount of work before you get to keep anything. And each time we buy a product, the accrued tax on the manufacture, the transport, the labour costs of every component that goes into making a product adds up to far more than just the superficial 20% sales tax that goes on top of even that. So we put the fifth of the price of whatever goods we buy is added on again to the government, as well as all these accumulated taxes paid during the manufacture process. This is a very, very significant tax burden, as well as also being taxed on our income. We're taxed at both ends. And then, of course, we have the inflation of the money supply through money printing or quantitative easing, whichever term you want to use for it. And this means that that basically our unit of currency that we earn is worth less and less each year. So both of these forms of expropriation of your wealth amounts to you being robbed of your time. You work more and more to store the same amount of value, which is effectively robbing you of the freedom to spend your time as you wish, and denying you the ability to act on your judgment of how to spend the stored value that has just been stolen from you. In the same way that if a mugger pickpocket or somebody puts a gun to your head and steals your wallet, if you were going to go out to the shops that day and buy yourself a new cutlery set, anything, a new computer, a new iPhone, your ability to act on your own judgment has been robbed from you, along with that money that you would have gone away and exercised your judgment on spending it. So there are many more ways in which our freedom is being lost. I'm not allowed to live on my own land here in the UK. That's a very, very obvious lack of freedom. People don't even appreciate that. People that visit my organic farm are surprised to say, "Oh, can't you live on your own land?" So most people don't even appreciate that the planning system here in the UK, and probably in other places too, is more than just about controlling buildings and making sure you build them all well and properly so they don't fall down. It's about issuing a dwelling permit to actually have the right to spend as many consecutive nights as you like on your own piece of turf, which is obviously a colossal infringement on our freedom. So what can we do about all this? Well, I propose there's a lot of action that we can take and that we must take. Freedom is fundamentally important, as I hope I've made clear, and we must understand it and what it swings upon. We must talk about it and help others to understand it. Otherwise, we will all lose it. So this is a key thing that we can do, is get in the conversation. We have to exercise the freedoms that we still have. Choose to think and exercise your judgment, which you're free to do, on any idea you hear or any character you meet or any behavior you witness. Exercise your judgment. Consciously make lifestyle choices that support your well-being. Choose food to consciously nourish yourself. This is a massive area where we still have freedom. So many people are suffering ill health and indeed dying by eating the wrong foods, and yet we are completely free at the moment here in the UK and across most of the Western world to choose what we eat, and yet we poison ourselves. We are eating ourselves to death. So this is a huge area where we can exercise freedom and really seriously empower ourselves into better health and better mental clarity. So vigilance, it has been said, is the price of freedom. So we must choose to care about the greater political context in which we live. You can choose to inform yourself, educate yourself about how to achieve and maintain health and what's happening in the world and the importance of the non-aggression principle. All of these things we can learn and indeed spread in conversation. As we've identified, being free means being free to be yourself and not living your life according to the expectations of others. This means breaking out of the matrix. It really does. It means living for yourself. Think for yourself. Design your own life. Dare to be different. This is a really key way that we can express freedom and keep alive the idea of freedom even whilst we lose political freedom. Knowledge is not an end in itself. Use it in the form of reasoned argument to spread pro-freedom ideas, pro-human life ideas. Help to rationally persuade others of their need for freedom, because this really is the only way to change the world, when we rightly reject the use of force and coercion. We don't want to legislate people into doing anything. We want to persuade them of the best forms of behaviour. So lastly, argue for and defend the freedom of others. And this includes the right to express ideas that you disagree with. Even if you know that they are wrong, we must champion the freedom of other people, and allow reason and evidence and persuasion to be the tools that expose bad ideas. You don't need to silence bad ideas. They fall on themselves in the face of better ideas. So I hope this helps. Visit the website lawfulrebel.com. There's stacks more on there. And thank you very much for listening. Meanwhile, love your life.